I'd like to welcome you. I'm Brenda Katz, and I am the recording secretary of the Hebrew Congregation of Chautauqua and serve as co-chair of the Sunday evening Shirley, Lazarus series, along with our president, Esther Norton. It is a pleasure to welcome you here on this lovely sunny evening with no technical difficulties whatsoever. And I would like to extend a special welcome to our president, Michael Hill. And I also would like to know, how many of you are here for the first time? Okay, well, a special welcome to you and a welcome back to the rest of you, and we hope that all of you will continue to support our programs along with the wonderful programming we have at the institution. This evening we are going to be treated to a talk by Amit Taneja, who is an inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility, which IDEA are the letters for it, professional with a specialization in higher education and nonprofit IDEA work. He has served as the inaugural Chief IDEA Officer at 3 different institutions and joined Chautauqua as its inaugural Senior Vice President and Chief IDEA Officer last spring in May of 2021. Amit works to transform institutions by moving beyond trainings, diversity statements, and unconscious bias to strategies and plans toward conscious inclusion. He believes in the healing and transformative power of engaged dialogue and is a trained facilitator for the University of Michigan's intergroup dialogue pedagogy. And one very interesting fact, which I'm sure that well, maybe Michael knows this, but he is also a techno DJ and makes his own ties and bow ties. There will be a bus which will leave at 8:15 from the corner of Clark and Foster. So if you need to leave prior to our completion of question and answering, that it will be up at that corner. And please, at the end, when you do have questions, if we would come to the mic here to ask them so that everyone can hear them. Without further ado, comment.
Ned is working. Can we give Ned a round of applause? While he's working on trying every single adapter we have, let's see if we get it up. If not, I'm also good at improvising, so I'm going to buy myself some time by telling you a little bit of an origin story that maybe helps you understand a little bit more of my deeper values and sort of my history and my roots. So I was born and raised in India, in Punjab, which borders Pakistan. My family only lived about 15 miles from Pakistan. And an interesting fact is that both sides of my family were in the part of India before India was partitioned into India and Pakistan, where there was a primary population of Hindus and Sikhs. And the way the British ruled India was through their official policy was divide and conquer. So as long as the Hindus were fighting the Sikhs were fighting the Muslims were fighting the Christians. As long as we were all fighting each other, nobody was fighting them. So I'll keep, if the display comes on, just clap to tell me, then I'll wrap up my story a little quicker. In the 1920s, 30s, and even up to the 40s, it was not uncommon for families in the region that I lived in to raise one son, not daughter, one son Hindu and one son Sikh. And the reason you do that is if there was a riot that broke out in your town, the people who came to burn your house down were never from your neighborhood, right? They came from outside the neighborhood, so they didn't really know. And what you do is you put, if it was a Hindu mob outside of your door, you put the Hindu son out, and if it's a Sikh mob, you put the Sikh son out. And it was a survival strategy, right? So my grandfather was raised Hindu, and his 2 brothers were raised Sikh. So that was the sort of historic part of my family roots. And then throughout my life, I looked like this. My family practices both Hindu and Sikh traditions. And I don't look visibly Sikh, which meant when I was growing up, there was a movement for Punjab, which is the Sikh state, to secede from India. which meant that late at night, most of my life as a child, I could not leave my home after dark because it was not safe to do that. And then fast forward 12 years, now it's about 12 years old, I moved to a different province called Uttar Pradesh, which is where the Hindus and Muslims, this legacy of not trusting the other, and particularly on lines of faith, is very strongly rooted, still to some would argue, in the Indian culture. It's a legacy left over from colonial British Empire. And from age 12 to 18, what I experienced was the tension and the riots between Hindus and Muslims there. I tell you this all to lay a foundation to say most of my life I was surrounded by people who told me, don't trust X, right? Whatever that group was. And I got to see unfortunately, and I'm sorry, I'm going to do a trigger warning here, what real, actual violence in the name of faith and religion looks like, particularly in the name of faith and religion. And over time, it really made me question, so if I'm being taught that don't trust X, don't trust Y, what are they being taught about me? What are the lies that other people may have internalized about my faith, about my upbringing, about my values, and how hate is not something that we're born with, but it's something that is taught to us. Right? So that is what really brought me into this IDEA work, inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility. I've been doing it for over 2 decades now. Mostly done it in the context of higher education, and I was so excited when this job opened up. Some of you have heard this story. My partner actually he's from Chautauqua County, he used to work at the bookstore. Fast forward a few years, I didn't know him at that time, but we came to Chautauqua. The very first time we came to Chautauqua, I went to a lecture. I think we might have seen theater that day too. And I remember us walking to the bell tower and having this conversation about how magical this place is. Magical enough to the point that we actually walked up to Vestor Plaza where the ERA real estate office is. We were fresh out of grad school. I'm like, what does it look like? And I looked at the flyer and I'm like, okay, maybe some other time. We could have wasn't quite in my heart, but it was, when you find a place that you instantly fall in love with, it just is magical when that happens, and that was my experience here. So, we're still working maybe? Okay. Okay, hey, thank you for that problem solving. So maybe I'm going to do things a little bit out of order. So before I formally begin, I want to take a second to recognize that so much of what we do here rests on the shoulders of volunteers who make the magic of Chautauqua happen. And with that in mind, I'd really like to thank the organizer of the Lazarus series, Esther Northman and Brenda Kratz, and all the members on the board of the Hebrew congregation. So if you're there, just raise your hand. Thank you. Chautauqua would not be what it is without all the folks who volunteer their time, their talents, and their resources to make this the lovely place that it is. I'm going to use my slides here just as a guide so that I remember what to do. So we may or may not get to my real life activity, my live polling. If it happens, great. If not, we can talk about something else. There's 3 things I was hoping to do. One, to just get a sense of the room as I'm engaging people in conversations around inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility, which I'm going to call IDEA or IDEA. I'm trying to get a sense of how people are thinking about it. The second thing I wanted to do is do a very, very, very high-level introduction of what all is included in the IDEA plan. And the third thing I wanted to do was talk a little bit around, because one of the most common questions I'm getting is, what's working, what's not working, what can we do better as a community to create a more inclusive and welcoming environment? How many people read my column in the weekend edition of the Daily? I see a few hands go up. Some of you may have liked it, some of you may have read it and said, this is not Chautauqua, this is not familiar to me. And if you're there, that's okay. We will talk about that as well. But I'd like to spend a little bit of time on those common themes that I took up in that article. So if you haven't read the article yet, no worries, we will get there. Okay, so I'm gonna skip through all of my slides there. And okay, so let me tell you just a little bit around the IDEA plan. If you haven't read it yet, I really encourage you to take a few minutes to look at the strategic plan that we put out about 3 months ago. It's a quick read, it's a little booklet. I do have printed copies that I left promptly in my apartment, so there we go for being late. My cat threw up right as I was leaving, so I was running late, and you know, if you're a cat parent, you know how that goes. So the IDEA plan, all of last season what I did is I walked around and I talked to Chautauquans, I talked to board members, I talked to staff, I talked to community leaders, and I took over 80 pages of notes of their hopes, their dreams, their desires, their anxieties around what we needed to do. And one of the things that became really clear to me is that if we are ever going to be successful at meeting the big picture goals of making Chautauqua more inclusive, more diverse, more equitable, and more accessible, that every single person who calls themselves a Chautauquan, whether they be a staff member or a board member, needs to have a role to play in it, right? So it can't be Amit's plan, it can't be the institution's plan, it can't be the Michael's plan, it can't be the Colonnades plan. It has to be every single person has a role to play in it. That doesn't mean that everybody has the same role, but that we all have something to contribute, something to learn, something to add to those efforts. So the IDEA plan has 5 different strategies, 5 different things that we're focusing on. So the first one is really around the staff and board. For us to really create an inclusive and welcoming environment, we want to make sure that the staff and board are up to date with trainings, with how we approach and think about this work. So we've already started doing that. So 93% of our full-time staff members, year-round full-time staff members, receive a mandatory IDEA training. The board received a mandatory IDEA training. And really trying to get them to think about the complexity of inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility work. So our first emphasis is on staff and boards, talked about training. The other part of that plan is recruitment and retention of diverse staff members. So we all know that nationally there is a crisis, right, around hiring, and particularly in certain fields. But if we become an employer of choice, where our employees are saying, Chautauqua is an amazing place to work at, and especially if you are diverse. And when I say diverse, I mean diversity broadly, right? By race, by gender, by sexuality, by religion, by disabilities. That is where we're heading, and so that could be very helpful for us. And the last piece of the emphasis on staff and board is philanthropy. There are lots of Chautauquans who understand the need for us to be able to, that this work is going to need resources, right? So the best example I can give you around that is accessibility. So if it's not from a lack of willingness, but I often get the question of, can't you find $15,000 to put an elevator in Hillquist? I know a couple of you laugh. Now, I do think that putting an elevator in Hillquist is really, really important. Does anybody here want to take a guess at what an elevator in Hillquist that's only going from floor 1 to 2, what that might cost?
75. Yeah.
Sorry?
75.
75? 100? 200? Nah, you're all going under. It's 350,000. So that's not to say, I want to be really clear that this doesn't come across as me saying, oh, it costs that much money, we're never going to be able to do it. But if we are going to get there, right, so part of our emphasis here is to do an accessibility audit, which I'm going to jump around a little bit. So one of the fourth objective of our plan is really to focus on policies and procedures. So really thinking about our policies around when we build buildings, when we update buildings, And one of the major part of that is an accessibility audit. So right now, we have hired an ADA accessibility firm that is looking at 36, I want to say, of our most primarily used buildings, and looking at everything from signage to ramps to elevators to whatever we need to do to make those buildings ADA compliant, right? So some of our buildings right now are accessible, but they're not ADA compliant. So let me give you a quick example of that. How many people have been to the Children's Beach? Children's Beach, okay. So if you need to use the bathroom near the Children's Beach, there is a wooden path, a wooden docks basically, that can take you down to the bathroom, but there is no resting area. So the ADA basically says that it's not just a ramp. If you're a person using a manual wheelchair, you may need to rest your arms. And they have a very prescribed plan that every 15 feet you need to have a flat surface, fully flat surface, so that if you're going up or down, that you can rest your arms before you carry. You need to have guardrails on either side. So technically, we are accessible to get to the bathrooms at Children's Beach, but in reality, it's not ADA compliant, right? So that is some of the work we're doing with the IDEA plan. A couple other things in the plan. So the second one, this is where you all come in, is that we really need every single Chautauquan and community group to be involved in IDEA work. So that might mean denomination houses coming up with their own IDEA plan, to think about how they're going to make their building more inclusive and accessible, to think about what they have in terms of artwork around and what message that might send to different communities, especially as they start to bring more diverse communities here. It also means that we engage more in thoughtful dialogue. I don't think there'll be a lot of people here who would disagree with me that we have forgotten how to have conversations with our neighbors, with our friends, and with people that we agree with and people that we might disagree with, right? The rule that I was told at dinner party, what are the things you don't talk about at a dinner party? Politics, religion, sex, and money is the other things I was told, and then I thought, wow, dinner parties would be very boring, but okay. But that's right. The idea is that you don't go to anything controversial. So part of our focus, and I'm gonna, Lynn is not here today, but Roger Depke is. So Lynn Stahl and Roger Depke, who did come and do the first Lazarus lecture here, told you about the Chautauqua Dialogues, and that's very much part of the IDEA plan, so that we learn as a community to be able to talk to folks who may think differently, who may experience the world a little bit different than us. The third focus in the IDEA plan is really around how do we welcome more diverse communities here. I want to pause and say a couple things about that. I wrote a column about 2 weeks ago in the Daily that talked about how the institution and how I am thinking about this. So I'm not interested in going door to door and saying, oh, you're diverse, would you like to come to Chautauqua? That's not a good strategy. The other thing I want to note is that I often hear from people, well, you know, if you want to make Chautauqua racially diverse, you're going to have to create scholarships. And that may be true for some percentage of the population, but I'm going to use myself as a really good example of this. I fell in love with this place. I am still in love with this place. The first day that I came, I could absolutely afford to come to Chautauqua for several weeks. I could potentially afford to buy a very small condo in Chautauqua. So the point is not about necessarily going out and making scholarships and stuff, but how do we find folks for whom the 4 pillars, or at least 2 of the 4 pillars, matter a lot, right? So there are absolutely diverse folks out there that care about religion, that care about education, recreation, and the arts. And my working theory is that the people who come here actually need to fall in love with 2 of our 5 pillars. So some of you may have heard me talk about this. We actually have a 5th hidden pillar that we don't talk about it, that I affectionately call the porch. So every Chautauquan that I see, they build a community on the porch, whether it is the porch of the Everett Jewish Life Center, or whether it's the porch of the Athenaeum or the porch of a private house or a rental. The porch is where we experience community. That is how generations of Chautauquans have come here and decide to come here because of the community we build. So there are diverse communities out there that want that experience and care about our 5 pillars, so to say. So the big question is, how do we find them, right? How do we connect with them? And my strategies there really are to partner with national, regional organizations that serve diverse communities. So for example, the National Hispanic Lawyers, the National Hispanic Bar Association might be an example. Regional community groups, like in Cleveland, there's a Federation of Indian Community Organizations. So the strategy would be not go again door to door, but work in partnership with those organizations. And one of the things that we're going to try and do better on our program end is try to create, as an initial introduction, more alignment in our day, right? So if we bring the Dance Theater of Harlem on Tuesday and Stacey Abrams on Thursday, right? What is the incentive for somebody to come for 3 days? That may be a little bit harder, but if there is a way for us to align our program where there's particular interest groups or particular topics that may speak to different communities, then I can imagine as an initial step, 1, 2, 3 buses coming down from Cleveland because we've made the case that this is a place for you to come and explore. And that's where, if we can create a totally welcoming and inclusive experience, then people are going to want to come back. Now, this is my caveat. I am not running out and trying to do that work first, because this is my honest worry. We will only get one chance to get it right? So if we invite a diverse group from Pittsburgh, and they come here, and they get little pinpricks all day, or they feel like, I just felt like an outsider the whole day, they're never coming back. They're telling all their friends, don't ever go there, it's a waste of time and money, I felt uncomfortable. So part of what this gathering here too is to kind of raise some awareness of what happens sometimes happens when diverse communities do come here. So I'll tell you a little bit about that in a second. The last part of the IDEA plan is partnering with community organizations and businesses. And that really is the idea of how do we turn our gates into gateways. So I hear the question around not everybody can afford to be here. So part of my answer to that is, how do we build connections with mission-aligned community organizations that are doing important work that align with the kinds of questions that we are taking up. So let me give you a really good example of that. On August 9th, I want to say, we are inviting Matthew Desmond, who is an award-winning writer of the book Evicted, that talks about evictions and the housing crisis. Really amazing thinker. He not only presents the problem. How many people have read Evicted here? Okay, a couple folks. So you know how amazing that book is. He not only presents the problems, but he actually also presents some really thoughtful solutions that are not knee-jerk from the left or from the right narratives, right? In fact, he critiques both of them. Now, I will argue with gentleness and love in my heart that the vast majority of Chautauquans who are going to hear Matthew Desmond talk about homelessness, housing, and evictions are not experiencing any of those things in their lives right now. Is that true, right? For most, maybe not all. And in our driving distance, right, we have hundreds of organizations, whether they be really an organization based in dealing with housing issues, or it may be an organization that deals with substance use issues, or it may be an organization that deals with teen pregnancies. All of them have a common issue. Where do we find housing for our clients, right? And his book kind of tackles all of those topics. So what a shame, or a missed opportunity for us, that if we invite a national level speaker like that, and we have those issues in our local regional area, if we're not able to invite the folks who are actually doing the work on the ground, right? They're doing this day in, day out. And then imagine what happens to the dialogue that happens at Chautauqua after that, from an informed perspective of people who are doing this work in Chautauqua County, in Erie County. Does that make sense? Right? So part of our strategy there is to build those kinds of partnerships and then build partnerships with businesses that have employee resource groups. I'm going to move to something else in a minute, but I want to say one thing. I hear lots of Chautauquans talk about the moral and ethical case for why we need to make Chautauqua more inclusive, more diverse, more equitable, more accessible. And I fully believe in all of that. And I also believe in the business case for why we need to do this. So I'm going to give you some very quick examples of this. Everybody here has heard about the 150 Forward Strategic Plan for the institution? Okay. So that is our strategic plan that goes from 2018 through 2028. I'm going to give you 4 or 5 examples of how the strategic plan that is for the whole institution and the IDEA plan kind of work hand in hand. So for example, one of our goals is to increase census. It's the number of folks who come through our gates from 142,000 to 146,000. Okay, so it's a small goal. Just for this year, we're trying to get 4,000 extra people. Not all of them are going to be diverse, but some of them are. And the point is not to just bring them once, but to actually retain them. Again, I'm not interested in creating a series of one-time visitors. I'm interested in creating new Chautauquans. So that's one way. Another one, we talked about labor and talent solutions. We know there's a big labor crisis in this country. If we are able to attract and retain diverse employees, they want to stay here, they're not leaving because they don't feel included or stuff like that. That helps with the institution's larger goals. One of our biggest goals is to optimize the summer assembly and to make it even more fantastic. So whether it be through enhanced dialogues, or actually one of the things that I'm actually excited about in the plan that may sound silly is I recommended that we need a lot more ethnic food options. What happens for, yes? Okay, all right, good. Thank you for that. You know, what happens when you come here and don't see any of your food represented, right? And when I think about this, I think about a range of diets. Like, we need to have more vegan options, we need to have more kosher options, we need to have just more prepared food, right? And that makes sense because of the message it sends. Ooh, I think something might be coming on. But it also makes good business sense. So one of the ideas I'm floating around is like, I love that we have a buffet at the Athenaeum every day, but it's the same buffet 5 days in a week, right? So imagine what it might look like if it's Chinese cuisine on Tuesday, if it's an Indian buffet on Wednesday. I have to make a plug for my people, right? We are in an ethnic food desert, prepared ethnic food desert, so that helps our bottom line there too. If we make the institution more accessible, I truly believe that there are, and it's really heartbreaking for me to hear these stories when Chautauquans come up and say, this may be my last year because I just can't navigate the grounds because of mobility issues in particular, right? That breaks my heart, and I think we have work to do. So if we can fix the low-hanging fruit, right, make sure that our automatic bathroom door openers work at the end, to make sure that there is an automatic door opener at the colonnade, right, to make sure that our staff are trained to work with people who are differently abled. If we can retain those Chautauquans to come for another 5 years, 10 years, that's your business case. And I will argue, and I hope you would agree with me, that the longer you come to Chautauqua, the longer you live. The longer you come to Chautauqua, the longer you live. So it's a win-win. So those are some of the ways in which, you know, we're trying to have our the goals, I'm trying to give you just some glimpses. These are just small examples of how what we're trying to do at the larger institution and the IDEA plan really go hand in hand. The elephant in the room that we haven't talked about a little bit is the stories that I've heard from so many Chautauquans about why particularly diversifying our patron base racially is so important. I hear from so many Chautauquans who say that, from white Chautauquans who say, you know, my kids are coming here and they're married to a person of color and I have biracial grandchildren and they don't feel comfortable. And I'm really worried that when I pass on, that they're not gonna wanna come here, that there's not that anchor. I heard that story so many times, different versions of it. And then there was another story that I heard was from white Chautauquans who have white children and white grandchildren, who live in big cities, who have completely multiracial friend circles, and come here and say, this is not what I want my kids to think is the baseline, right? So it's not just folks who have, through marriage or through adoption or other ways, have kids of color. So I'm going to say something a little bit controversial, and please just only do this in your head and don't say anything. But walk around the AMP and grounds and notice parents and grandparents with children of color. That is the future of Chautauqua 20, 30, 40 years down the road. And if we don't fix that inclusiveness, if we don't start working on it now, there may be a time where it may be too late. I would argue, coming from higher ed, that most of the colleges that have closed are the ones who weren't able to figure out a way to diversify their patron base. We see this over and over with small colleges, and particularly faith-based colleges, that said, we only serve Catholics. I came from a Jesuit institution. One of the Jesuit institutions really was not able to figure out a way to expand beyond their Catholic base. That doesn't mean you lose your focus on Catholic principles, right, if that's what you're committed to, but they weren't able to translate that. And that is the risk that we face. What does, I'm going to ask this in a pointed way for those of you who are property owners. What does, you know, an 1,800 square foot house that is on the Chautauqua grounds really cost in Chautauqua County if there is no Chautauqua institution? That's not a $1 million house, it's a $150,000 house. That's the reality, right? And I don't like operating from a place of fear. All right, I'm gonna do a couple more things because we're running way late on time, and so I like to talk. Okay, so for those of you who read my article, so one of the questions I keep getting is what's working and what's not working. So some of the things I'm gonna talk about are gonna be a little difficult. And while I'm highlighting some of the negative stuff, please know that there's I love that. That's Chautauqua joy, I think. For every negative example, there's probably 5 or 10 things that do go right. So don't equate IDEA work with just negativity, but I'm going to point out some difficult things. All right, we don't have the screen, I'm just going to do without it. So the two things where things typically go wrong are highlighting of differences and making assumptions. So just remember, I here am reflecting back where in my role, the many meetings I've had, the many phone calls I've had, the many Zoom calls I've had, where people have shared with me how they felt like they did not belong or they felt other. So this is not my thinking. I think of myself as the keeper of the stories in that I hear these stories, but I'm also then the storyteller, right? To tell you what are the common themes that emerge. So let's start with the idea of highlighting difference. The idea is pretty simple. When a conversation either starts or very quickly turns to, I'm going to be laser focused on your differences, okay? I want to note here that often, I believe, often the intent when that happens is to express some form of welcome, maybe to start a conversation, maybe to start to build a connection. However, the impact is quite opposite. It makes people feel guarded. It makes them feel like, how quickly can I get out of this conversation, or makes them feel othered. So let me give you a few examples when I talk about highlighting differences and what that means. These are all real examples, and these are not the only ones. I chose these ones because I have multiple versions of the same incident playing out slightly differently. So the first one was somebody starting a conversation with a black individual with something like, "Your skin is so beautiful, I bet you don't get sunburnt." Another one might be touching somebody's hair, and this particularly happens to women of color or people who might have very curly hair, just going up and saying, "Oh, your hair's so beautiful," and that it looks unique. On the receiver's end, because I have lots and lots of friends, women of color, and this is a particularly persistent experience for them. I've had friends who are standing in line in Starbucks, and all they feel is their head being pulled. Because if you have curly hair, and somebody puts their hand in, the hand is going to get tangled, and it's going to pull. So it's not, and even if the intent is welcome, even if the intent is, I appreciate the beauty of your hair, the physical emotion, there's physical pain. So imagine how you would feel if you're just standing in line and you just experience that. Others might be, other ways of highlighting differences is commenting about people's name, their accent, their ethnic clothing sometimes, and being asked, so this happens a lot with our students, when somebody will say, this particularly to Asian Americans, I actually got a report of this like a couple of weeks ago, where a student of Asian descent was talking to a Chautauquan, and they said, "What's your name?" And she told them her name, and they said, "Okay, where are you from?" And she said, "Oh, San Francisco." And he said, "No, where are you really from?" And she said, "San Francisco." Okay, yeah, thank you. So, okay, all right. I have to say I got a little anxious because I thought you were clapping at the idea of where you were And then another one that I heard today was said to an African-American couple, that this was the opening line. They were meeting their neighbor, and the first thing she said was, I hope you'll feel welcome here. It's the same thing like if I just said to you, I'm going to freak some of you out, I hope there are no spiders under your chair. How many of you are thinking about spiders under your chair right now, right? I've kind of sent you a message, kind of a shot. The intent, again, is good. The impact may be a little bit othering. So these are what I hear from people when they say, why not seek the commonality first rather than starting with the difference? So it's not that people who are different are not willing to engage with that. But when we start with that, it right away says to them, you're different, you're other, and it sends a message of, do you belong here or not? Or that's the impact of how it lands. This was a really eloquent quote that I really appreciated. That one person who was telling me their story of feeling excluded said, we're all here at Chautauqua because we love the 4 pillars. Ask me how my day is going or what I thought about the lecture this morning. Seek a shared experience first and not the difference. So that's one level of, the highlighting difference. The other one is just making assumptions. And again, these might be genuine attempts at trying to start a conversation. However, the impact may be harmful. So here's some examples. A Chautauquan of color who was at the dance theater in one night was asked a couple times if they were family members of the performers for the dance theater of Harlem. And later they were asked if they were art students. Why can we not imagine that these are just ordinary Chautauquans who happen to be black? Why would we start a conversation with, are you a family member? Can we not imagine folks who are black or African American caring about the 4 pillars and just coming because they want to see a world-renowned dance theater company? A person who uses, so this is a real example, person who uses a manual wheelchair was approached by somebody who came and said, "You're not going to make it up the hill, I'm going to give you a push." The part I didn't include in my article for space limitations is before he could respond, they went back and started pushing his wheelchair. Yeah, so I'll tell you in having this conversation, this person could have bench pressed me. Like, they had arms like this big, and I felt like, oh, I should go to the gym more often, because they were inspiring me to do so. But again, the assumption is, I see you in a wheelchair, I see what you can't do, or assume what you can't do, and it was a really othering experience for them. Another example was diverse Chautauquans who were misidentified and assumed to be someone else, or staff get mistaken for CTC performers. This is an interesting story in that it happened last year to a performer, a black performer who had dreads, and so does one of our staff members, and they got interchanged all the time. And once it happened from 2 African American guests who did that. So it's not only white Chautauquans who did it. So I'm just trying to complicate this for us a little bit here. And then the other examples are even property owners who might be just property owners of color just cleaning their own porch, and somebody stops by and says, "What's your hourly rate? You know, is the mistress of the house there?" You know, those kinds of questions that makes people feel othered. So I'm going to share something that had me riled up a little bit all day, because somebody I don't very much agree with came up to me today at the tent and said, "Oh, I read your article, and some of my friends were wondering how much of that was real, or did you make it all up, and how many of those examples were made up?" And I pride myself at being very thoughtful and measured in my responses, but I have to tell you, I snapped really badly at that. Because at the core of that question for me was really questioning my integrity. That's what it comes down to, right? They made an assumption about me, about my work, that I would cook up those examples for I don't know what reason or to what end. And I was probably a little less than, usually I'm much more educational, but in this case I said, that is really insulting. You're questioning my integrity. But then I went home and I took a moment to think about that more. My partner is a therapist, so he said, you know, empathy for, it's really hard if you have come here for 30 years and only experienced welcome, inclusion, I feel like I belong here all the time, and I'm giving you 50 examples of other people not feeling. I need to have better empathy to understand it from their experience, because they have never felt it or seen it, so we need more people to build empathy. I get asked a lot about how I might help with idea work from folks. If you notice an act of inclusion happening in front of you, how might you react? And my request is educate people, call them in, don't cancel them, don't call them out, don't call them bad words, but talk about the impact of what may have happened. And the only way you're going to be able to do it, whether you see it happening on the brick walk or in the amp or somewhere else, is if you practice doing this in your head. Deal with kindness in education. Other things you can do is, I'm super proud of this, I really pushed for it. Next year, the first week, the theme of the week is friendship. Invite your friends who have not been to Chautauqua to come here, but particularly invite your diverse friends. If you're involved with community groups, invite them to think about idea work more, and really think about what part of idea work belongs to you. Don't wait for Superman, Superwoman, Superhuman to come fix all these issues. Sometimes people come up to me and say, well, I really want to work on being an active anti-racist. One of the things I did right after summer of 2020, because a lot of people were asking that question, was I wrote this free guidebook. It's available online if you want to take a quick picture of that. The link is up there at holycross.edu/anti-racism guidebook. It's a step-by-step process to help you figure out what your work looks like. Okay, so I've talked more than I needed to. Actually, we don't have a lot of time left for questions, but I'll open it up for questions. Go ahead, Joe. Yeah, please come up to the mic. Okay, all right, and I'll repeat it. But if other folks want to ask, come up to the mic.
Well, you said something about how the British were operating in India.
Yep.
And I just wonder if you think that part of the colonial method of operating is to foment division and anger among different groups in the areas they control, even though Western colonials normally talk about how we have to achieve peace.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So I think everybody heard the question, but it's really centered around how the colonial ethos of divide and conquer plays out in a lot of different places. I mean, I would argue that it's playing out in the States now. How many times are we told to be fearful of those liberals or those conservatives, those northerners or those southerners? These are, I was actually really moved by our local Republican congressman who is retiring, and I went to his kind of retirement thing. One of the things he talked about is like, folks, think about us on the global scale, that we have so many issues in the U.S.'s space in the global political economy, that we actually have a lot more in common. We've just been led to believe over and over to fear the other and stuff, and I totally get all the ways in which we continue to become more polarized, but I personally refuse to write people off as long as we're dealing with facts. The place where I can't go is the election deniers, the vaccine deniers. I don't have time for that, I understand that, but yeah, the divide and conquer is absolutely working everywhere. And I'm going to make this more local. I will imagine, it's been my case, that there will be folks in Chautauqua who are going to do that too. And it really boils down to a very simple philosophy. Oh, all this diversity work that's happening, I'm going to assume it's a zero-sum game. So what are you going to have to give up for more diversity to come here? That's one way to frame it. A whole different way to frame it is, what am I going to gain, right? You're not getting the ethnic food without this plant. You're not getting the ability to be in conversation with the folks who are dealing with evictions on a day-to-day basis without this plant. You gain a lot from it, you don't lose. So let's get rid of that zero-sum thinking. Go ahead, and then please go ahead, line up, and I'm gonna try and be more concise in my answers.
Thank you very much. This has been a long time coming, and I'm very happy. I'll just start with an anecdote. 10 years ago, I was with my ex, who was a black Caribbean, and we went on the Sunday to hear the Marine Band play. And the techs from the Marine Band were standing behind us in the amphitheater. And when we came up, one of the tech guys said, "Oh man, you just cost me $50. And Rodney said, "What are you talking about?" He said, "I had $50 on the fact that no black guy would be in the whole amphitheater, and you showed up."
Yeah.
So this is really needed. I hope that we'll get a chance to talk later. But my question is, you talked about approaching groups, and you started with national groups and then regional. And coming from Canada, I have a real problem with American exceptionalism.
Sure.
Because this is a problem for us when we come here. And Chautauqua is within 3.5 hours of 8 million diverse people.
Very
Toronto
diverse.
is no longer a white city.
Yep.
It is a majority people of color. And so my question to you, and I would love to take a straw vote, is would the institution be really offended if we had an all-out campaign to bring in the Canadians?
Sure.
I mentioned that the organ is called the Massey organ, and that the top street is called Massey Avenue, and the Masseys were a Toronto company that founded my church, And they came because then nationalism didn't matter. They were Methodists, and that was all that mattered. So I really think this is the answer to the problem that you've presented to us.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that, and I'm having a total yay, exactly moment from that. So the quick answer to that is yes, that is absolutely something I talked about when I actually interviewed for this job. We are going to need a little bit more resources to really break into that market. So there's been some talk about Chautauqua on the road. So how do we build, again, I'm not going to rent a theater in Toronto and say Chautauqua Institution is here. That's not how you do it. You build partnerships with Toronto organizations, with art organizations, or other groups. And so we've talked about it. It's probably going to take us a year or two, maybe something like that, to get down there. But I agree with everything you said. Thank you.
Hi, I want to say how important this work is that you're doing in giving all these different examples of things that can go wrong when people are trying to do the right thing. So many people are not aware. I've had some IDA training through a volunteer, and I didn't know this, or I didn't know someone would be affected by that, or I heard about other people who talked about their experiences. So I think that's really important. And well, it's not a minor question, just you brought it up about people who can't get around in Chautauqua, they have to stop coming. That's what happened with my mom. And I wanted to thank, I don't know if you are a part of it, but I saw that several of the roads have been re-asphalted. If you are in a wheelchair or a scooter and the street is all broken up, it makes it extremely difficult to get around.
Yes, thank you for that. Yeah, I can't take credit for the roads. We actually do a little bit of road repair every year. In fact, the 2% that is collected when there's a sale of property from the buyer and the seller, that pot of money is part of our bigger operation that funds the capital project. So that includes everything from road repairs to putting that elevator in Hultquist to putting painting, roofs, all that kind of stuff. And so one of the things that I'm really interested in doing is building an endowment. So this is where I'm going to critique Chautauqua just for a small moment. I came from Hamilton College, which was founded around the time that Chautauqua was, and College of the Holy Cross, which was founded around the time Chautauqua was. Similar profile of folks who went there. Holy Cross had an endowment of $800 million, and Hamilton had an endowment of $1 billion. This is just me speaking as Amit, not as Senior VP, but I think we really need to work on building our endowment. And if I can have an accessibility endowment, right, that every year spits a certain amount of money that is designated, then I can be really attentive to say, what is the smartest use of $100,000 or $200,000 every year, as opposed to getting one gift that I spend right away, but then I have to keep raising it over and over. So my fundraising philosophy is give me 75% in an endowment, give me 25% in current spend, and that's how we have change happen. But I agree with everything. Thank you. Yeah, hi.
There are a lot of people here who have been here for many generations. Have you encountered people who say, I want it to be the way it was. I don't like all this, I don't need all this, it's good enough for my great-great-greats and my whatever, or do they just avoid you and they just don't engage?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Some of them, maybe not as directly, have felt, I think there may be a strain of folks who think, why the DC office, why climate change, why IDA? So it's more the direction in which the institution is going. And I would argue, again, I do not like to operate from a place of fear, but if we don't get this right, we are in deep trouble 15, 20 years down the road. And the closest example I can give to this is higher ed, because I worked there. I came from an institution where 1 year's tuition, housing, and boarding was $76,000. We had to repeat it 4 years in a row, right? And part of it was because they had not really done this work, to build endowments, to build things like that. which meant access became really hard. If we don't start earning revenue outside, if we don't start expanding revenue, if we don't start having more people coming to the grounds, what happens to the gate pass is very similar to what happened to college tuition. It did not go up in the same line as inflation. It went up like this if you look at historic data. So I believe in why we're doing this, and that's really hard to see if you're looking backwards and say, for 5 generations, this has worked. So I don't see, but we live in a very different world. So for those folks, that is why I make the business argument, so that people just don't think of this as about, well, you know, we need to have X percentage of people who look different here. But there's a really strong business reason to do this work.
You indicated that change can't take place overnight, especially when you're looking at the demographics of people who supported this institution for over 100 years, and you look at the median age of the people even in this room. I haven't heard you talk about youth. This is a perfect place to bring young people. Schools would just love it. Field trips, retreats, programs, even in the off-season. And then maybe when those people who are intermingling and intermarried and so on, as you indicate, when they grow up, maybe they'll want to come here, and that diversity will be there. I appreciate the work you're doing, but I'm afraid dealing with the demographics that we have, you're not going to change it overnight. And I think youth is where you should put your concentration.
Thank you. Yeah. And clap to that. I'm 100% on board with that. I try to think of it as both and, right? So there are actually people who I think are very ripe for Chautauqua, who are diverse, who will come here. But we're not going to make the long-term case until we figure out a way to create experiences for young people where they fall in love with Chautauqua like you all may have fallen in love with Chautauqua, right? So I have to tell you, one of my most negative experiences or tensions as a Chautauqua staff member was 2 nights ago at the ABBA concert, where I had to go and tell the young people to sit down because the Chautauquans sitting behind them had all kinds of mobility issues, and they're like, I can't see it, and there's a group of 40. Did people go to the ABBA concert? Okay. That was programming magic. Because we had 15-year-olds and 75-year-olds all dancing to the same thing. I loved it, and I think, so we need to do more programming, create more opportunities for youth, and I'm 100% on board with that, yeah. It's gonna take a little while to build that muscle. Go ahead.
You've been talking about idea within the institution, but all of us go outside the institution at various times. And you've been talking about having local groups and other groups partnering with them to have them come in. I think it has to be a mindset that we take outside the institution when we go away. When we go anywhere, we can't have a different mindset there than we do here. We'll alienate. There's already a town-gown alienation.
Yes.
And if you continue to alienate people outside the institution, you'll have a hard time getting them to come in.
Yeah, absolutely. I actually 100% agree with that. I've only been here for a year, and I joined the board of the Chautauqua Region Community Foundation so that my expertise is now being used in the local community. We're also doing all this, so I think this is the first time in a while that this, you can check me on this, CSO is going to the Reg Lene Center in Jamestown to perform. Has that happened before? August 12th, right? So we are trying to do this two-way partnerships. We invited all of Chautauqua County to come to the grounds for free on July 21st. And it was supposed to be Isabel Wilkerson's lecture, but it was really Chautauqua Institution and YWCA that ran a Chautauqua County-wide book read where our trained facilitators, our expertise in convening led to 14 different group discussions. So we're taking our expertise out there as an institution. The only other thing I would say is the dialogue piece, which I have so much hope for, is that if people come to the Chautauqua dialogues and experience what it feels like, what is the skill set to talk to somebody you disagree with. Take that skill back to your dinner table, to your community groups, to your home organizations. We need to spread Chautauqua out. So I agree, thank you. All right, I am conscious of time, and I'm happy to keep going, and I'll hang around here. So why don't we make this the last question, and then if others have some, please come and talk to me.
My question somewhat echoes the last question. With the widening class divide in the United States, and Chautauqua kind of having this reputation, especially in the local community, the place for the affluent, for the people that went to the fancy colleges, how do we reach out in those other communities and get people, the local townspeople who want to come in here, or people from even out of the area who, didn't go to an Ivy League school and don't make 6 figures a year?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Part of it is in our new ticketing model, right? There's a little bit of like ability to pick and choose. You don't have to do a full day. The other thing I'll tell you is we've started doing more collaborations with community groups. So I got a phone call a week around July 1st from the Omega Mentoring Program that operates out of Buffalo. These were young people who were 1 block from the Tops Market in Buffalo where the racially motivated shootings happened. And they had to be locked down for 6 hours. And their CEO called me and he said, Renee Elise Goldsberry was coming. All these students had seen Hamilton. And he said, can we bring a bus of 30 to 40 people, right? And that, again, that's a place where if I'm only doing it once a season, that's fine. My budget will cover it, we'll figure out the cost. I don't want it to be once a season. I want 40 different partnerships, not just as a patronizing way. This is an organization that does a lot with the arts. There is mission alignment, right? If it was a basketball camp, unless we have a basketball speaker, I'm not seeing the connection. So you're right that we need to do more of that. The Chautauqua County Day on Wednesdays is Education Wednesday, so anybody who's in K-12 or in a college in Chautauqua County can come to the grounds for free. So we're creating these pathways, but all of these are also economic decisions, right? So I don't want to, sometimes people say, well, why can't Chautauqua just write out a certain number of passes? And the answer is we do. We do. Not when a person calls, but when a group calls and if there's mission alignment. And there is a reality, if like 400 extra people are coming every day, we need more staff, we need more security, we need more seating, we need more trains. So it's not a cost neutral thing. But again, in my big vision, this may sound like a sales pitch, but that's not my intent. I'm trying to help you see my thinking. If I have an IDEA endowment that allows me to do a little bit more, how do we make greater access? It's going to take a while. Like, I don't want to paint a really rosy picture and say, in the next 3 years I'm going to make these relationships with 40 different organizations, but that work is happening. So I am so grateful to all of you for the time and attention. I know we ran over a little bit. I hope this is helpful. I'm going to stick back, come up and say hello. I will wear a mask. If you would like to one, please do so.